My cute neighbor took me to her family barbecue and then, in front of her entire family, she introduced me as her boyfriend without warning. But I had never once held her hand. I had never taken her on a proper date, never been anything to her but the quiet, solitary man who lived next door. I was standing in the grassy backyard of a house I had never once entered, awkwardly holding a paper plate of sticky ribs, when the woman who waved at me every morning across our shared wooden fence turned to her father and said, "Daddy, this is the boyfriend I've been telling you about." I almost dropped the plate. 20 pairs of eyes instantly turned toward me, locking onto my face. Her father's weathered face broke into a smile so incredibly wide and genuine it made my chest ache, and I had exactly 3 seconds to decide. I could blow up her lie right here in front of everyone she loved, or I could play along. My name is Ethan. I'm 34, divorced for 2 years now, the kind of man my ex-wife once described in a single, quiet, devastating sentence. She said living with me was like living with furniture. Present, functional, never in the way, but never truly in the room either. I didn't argue with her. I never do. Some men raise their voices when they're hurting. I just go quiet. Quiet like a house with the lights turned off. After the divorce, I moved into a small, unassuming rental with a porch too narrow for 2 chairs and a weathered fence line that separated my yard from hers. That is how I met her. Not through a conversation, but through a fence. Her name was Claire. She lived next door, tending a garden that always smelled of fresh rosemary and cut grass. Every morning at exactly 7:15, she would step outside in an oversized, faded flannel shirt, coffee mug in hand, and lift her hand in a small, cheerful wave across the fence before I had even opened my screen door. She never waited for me to wave first. She just did it every single day, like it was already decided between us that this quiet moment was ours. I found myself looking forward to that wave more than I looked forward to anything else in my life. I never told anyone that. I barely even admitted it to myself. Then, about 8 months ago, something changed. Every Saturday morning, I would open my front door to grab the newspaper, and there would be something sitting on my porch railing. A jar of homemade blackberry jam, a loaf of bread still warm enough to fog the plastic wrap, or a small potted herb with a folded note that simply read, "Thought you could use some greenery." No name, no signature, nothing. But I knew it was her. Nobody else in that neighborhood baked bread that smelled so comforting, like cinnamon and summer rain. I never once asked her why. I told myself it was just neighborly kindness, nothing more. But secretly, I counted every single one. 34 Saturdays. 34 small, quiet gifts left by a woman who barely said more than good morning to me. And every single time, I stood on my porch holding whatever she had left, asking myself the same question I never had the courage to ask her face to face. Why me? Then, 3 days before that barbecue, she knocked on my door for the first time in our 8 months of living beside each other. Not a wave, but an actual knock. She stood there in the doorway wearing a soft, forest green sweater, her hair pulled back, looking somehow more nervous than I'd ever seen her. She told me her family was hosting a barbecue that weekend, and her father's knee had been giving him trouble, and her brother was working a double shift. So they needed an extra pair of hands to help set up the heavy folding chairs and tables. Would I mind coming? I said, sure, just like that. No hesitation, no second thought. I didn't stop to wonder why, out of everyone she could have asked, she was standing on my porch asking me. The drive to her parents' house took 20 minutes down a winding road lined with old, majestic oak trees, their branches hanging so low they nearly brushed the roof of my car. The house itself sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, its white paint peeling gently at the corners, featuring a wide porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs that looked like they'd witnessed 30 years of Sunday dinners. Smoke curled up from a massive grill in the backyard, carrying the rich smell of charcoal and something sweet. Maybe brown sugar, maybe honey. String lights hung between the trees, waiting for the sun to go down. Claire's father met me at the gate. He was a broad, weathered man in his 60s with hands that looked like they had built half the house themselves. He looked at me the way fathers look at men they are quietly measuring, deciding in the first few seconds whether you are worth the trust they haven't given you yet. Then his face softened, and he pulled me into a firm handshake that turned into something close to an embrace. "Claire's told us so much about you," he said. I nearly choked on the words before they even fully registered. Told them so much about me? In 8 months of living next door to her, she'd never said more than a dozen sentences to me in total. And yet here was her father, treating me like I'd been a part of this family's Sunday dinners for years. I helped carry heavy, folding tables across the yard. I stacked chairs beside the porch. I laughed at stories about Claire as a little girl, chasing fireflies barefoot in this very yard. Stories told by aunts and uncles I had never met, but who somehow already knew my name. And then Claire walked out through the creaking screen door, crossing the yard toward me with an ease that startled me. She slid her arm through mine, her fingers hooking into the crook of my elbow like she'd rehearsed the motion 1,000 times in her head, and turned to her father with words that stopped my heart in my chest. "Daddy, this is the boyfriend I've been telling you about." The plate in my hands tilted dangerously. 20 faces turned toward me at once, and somewhere behind the glow of the porch light, I caught Claire's eyes locked onto mine. In them, I read a silent, desperate plea she could never have said out loud in front of her whole family. "Please, don't correct me. Not here. Not now." I gave her one small, reassuring nod. That was all it took. For the rest of the evening, I became Claire's boyfriend in front of the people who loved her more than anything on earth. I sat beside her at the long wooden table under the warm glow of the string lights. I let her lean her shoulder against mine when the conversation slowed into that lazy, comfortable rhythm only families seem to have. Aunts and uncles asked the usual polite questions. "What do you do? Where did you two meet? How long have you been together?" Claire answered every single one without missing a beat, speaking with a gentle confidence as if she'd rehearsed this exact moment 100 times in the mirror. 8 months, she said softly, exactly as long as she had lived next door to me. And that's when something cold and strange settled deep into my chest. Every detail she gave her family was true, every single one. The only thing she changed was one word. Neighbor became boyfriend. The rest of her stories were just our real life, tilted a few degrees toward a future that hadn't happened yet. Before I go any further into what happened that night, I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far, it's because you already care about how this ends. My ex-wife once told me I'd never build anything people would care about. She said it the week she left, standing in the doorway with her suitcase already packed in the car. She said I'd never make it to 50,000 people who would actually want to hear what I have to say. I didn't argue with her that day either. I just quietly promised myself I would. So, if this story is pulling at something inside you right now, if you want to see me prove her wrong, hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell before we go back into that backyard. Every single one of you watching this is part of that 50,000. Let's get there together. Now, back to the yard, back to the string lights, and back to the family who thought I belonged to their daughter. A man walked through the gate late, still dressed in his heavy work clothes, boots dusty and jaw set hard. It was Claire's brother, Marcus. He looked me up and down without offering his hand, sizing me up the way a man evaluates something he hasn't decided is safe yet. "So, you're the one Claire won't stop mentioning," he said flatly. That single sentence did two things at once. It told me Claire had indeed been talking about me for months behind closed doors, and it warned me that Marcus hadn't yet decided whether I deserved her. After the barbecue wound down, after the last plate was cleared and the aunts had hugged me goodbye like I was already family, Claire and I sat in my car in her parents' driveway. The porch light dimmed behind us. The string lights swayed gently in the breeze above the yard, throwing soft, shifting shadows across the hood of the car. The cool air still smelled like charcoal smoke and cut grass. For 3 full minutes, Claire said nothing at all. I watched the digital clock on my dashboard move from 9:14 to 9:17, holding my breath more times than I could count. Then she finally spoke, and her voice was quiet, worn smooth like a stone that had been turned over in someone's pocket for a very long time. "My dad's knee isn't the only thing that's wrong," she said. "He has a heart condition, congestive heart failure. The doctors gave him a timeline, Ethan. They gave my whole family a countdown, and nobody talks about it because if we say it out loud, it becomes real." She stared straight ahead through the windshield at the dark, empty road, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "He told my mother there's only one thing he wants before things get worse. He wants to see me settled, happy, with someone he trusts, before he runs out of time to trust anyone at all." She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were dry, but there was something behind them that looked like it had been crying for months without ever once letting a single tear fall. I couldn't bring just anyone into that house and lie to my father's face. I needed someone I actually trusted enough to stand next to. Someone who wouldn't turn this into something ugly. She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "You were the only person I could think of." I didn't say anything. I didn't reach for her hand, and she didn't reach for mine. We just sat there in the dark, 2 people who had somehow built an entire relationship out of nothing but 8 months of silent Saturday mornings and a wooden fence between 2 backyards. When I finally drove home that night, I walked into my quiet kitchen and stood there under the flickering yellow light, staring at the loaf of bread she'd left me 3 days earlier, now going stale on my counter. And for the first time since my divorce, I felt something crack open inside my chest that I thought had sealed shut for good. I wasn't angry that she'd used me. I wasn't even confused anymore about why she had chosen me out of everyone she knew. I was absolutely terrified, because somewhere between carrying folding chairs across that yard and hearing her father call me son before I'd even earned it, I realized I didn't want this to be pretend anymore, and that terrified me more than any lie ever could. I agreed to keep going, not because she asked me to, but because some part of me had already stopped pretending this was only about her father. Every Saturday after that, I found myself crossing that fence line for real, instead of just waiting for what she'd leave on my porch railing. I helped her father repair the loose, squeaking boards on his back steps, my hands blistering next to his while he told me stories about building that house with his own father 30 years earlier. I sat with Claire's mother on the porch on warm evenings, listening to her talk about the early, lean days of her marriage, back when she and Claire's father had nothing but a tiny rented apartment and a second-hand truck. Claire and I were honest with each other about the boundaries. This was still a performance, we told ourselves. Something we were doing solely for her father's sake, nothing more. No promises, no confusion. Just 2 people protecting a family from a truth too heavy to bear. But every Saturday, that boundary got a little thinner. Her fingers brushed mine when she passed me a plate, and she let them linger half a second longer than she needed to. She laughed at something I said in a way I had never heard her laugh with anyone else. Quieter, warmer, her eyes closing just slightly as if the sound belonged only to the 2 of us. I found myself checking the clock on Friday afternoons, counting down the hours until I could see her again, trapped inside a lie that had somehow started to feel more honest than my entire marriage ever had. Then one evening, everything nearly broke apart. Marcus showed up at my door without calling first. He stood on my porch with his arms crossed, jaw tight, wearing the exact same hard look he'd worn the night we met. "I need you to be straight with me," he said. "Do you actually care about my sister? Or is this just pity because of my dad? Because if it's pity, I need to know now. Not after she gets hurt." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the truth that rose up in me arrived with a sudden, beautiful certainty that startled even myself. "I don't know what to call it yet," I said slowly, "but every single morning before I even open my front door, I look for her across that fence before I look at anything else in my life. If that's not an answer, I don't have a better one." Marcus studied my face for a long time, searching my eyes. Slowly, something in his expression shifted. The way a man's shoulders drop when he finally decides the ground beneath him is solid. Then, for the first time, he offered me his hand. I took it. This time, it wasn't a test. It was acceptance. That same week, Claire's father collapsed in the kitchen. An urgent ambulance ride led to an overnight hospital stay. I sat beside Claire in that sterile hallway for 6 hours straight, surrounded by the sound of machines beeping and a room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. We held paper cups of lukewarm coffee neither of us drank, saying nothing, because there was absolutely nothing that needed saying. When her father finally opened his eyes and saw the two of us sitting there together at his bedside, he reached for Claire's hand first, then mine, and held them both at the same time. He squeezed them together, like he was tying a knot he'd been waiting months to finish. "I knew," he whispered, his voice rough and raspy from the oxygen tubes still taped to his face. He smiled weakly. "I knew from the very first night at that barbecue that you weren't really her boyfriend yet." He paused, his eyes crinkling. "But I also knew you would become one. Some things just need a little time, and a small push." Claire's hand tightened around mine, and for the first time since that first afternoon in the backyard, neither of us pulled away. He recovered slowly over the following months. He took slower steps and shorter walks around the yard, but he was steady, present, and very much alive. And somewhere in those quiet months, without either of us marking the exact day it happened, Claire and I stopped performing entirely. We started dating for real, quietly. No grand announcements, no explanations to anyone who hadn't already been standing in that backyard with us from the beginning. I stopped waiting for Saturday gifts on my porch railing because now I just walked next door instead. She stopped leaving folded notes because now she said the words herself. The fence between our 2 yards is still there, but there is a gate in it now. It's a gate we built together on a sunny Sunday afternoon, with her father supervising from a green lawn chair, calling out instructions he didn't really need to give, but we loved hearing anyway. 1 year after that first barbecue, her family held another one. Same backyard, same warm string lights, same rich smell of charcoal drifting into a soft summer sky. When Claire took my hand, walked me toward her father, and said, "Daddy, this is my boyfriend," she didn't need to add another word. And this time, I didn't almost drop the plate in my hands. I held it steady, sure of exactly where I was standing, and exactly why. I used to believe that being quiet made me forgettable. My ex-wife believed it, too. But Claire heard me anyway in the silence, in the small things left on a porch railing, in a wooden fence that slowly turned into a gate. She introduced me as her boyfriend before I ever became one. But maybe she wasn't early. Maybe I was just late. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer in the comments below. If someone you loved introduced you to their family as theirs before you had ever said a single word about it out loud, would you correct them in front of everyone they love? Or would you quietly